Becoming Beauvoir a Life. By Kate Kirkpatrick. 6. Rooms of Her Own. When the 21-year-old Beauvoir returned to Paris in September of 1929, she moved out of her parents' apartment, renting a fifth-floor room in her maternal grandmother's property at 91 Rue d'Enfert-Rochereau. Her grandmother had several lodgers and Simone had the same independence and rent as the rest. She decorated the walls with orange wallpaper. Elney helped her redecorate some second-hand furniture. Her mother had tears in her eyes when she moved out. Simone was grateful to her for not making a scene. Apart from during brief summer visits to Marignac, she had always shared a bedroom with Elney, so she was delighted to have for the first time in her life a room that was hers alone. Simone did not yet have a job of her own, but she and Sartre had discussed their future as their future. While he was doing military service, they would see as much of each other as possible. Beauvoir would stay in Paris rather than taking up a full-time teaching post, since that would give her time to start on a novel. She did some part-time tutoring and taught Latin and Greek at the Lycée Victor Duruy a few hours a week, which gave her enough to live on. After the exacting schedule that led up to her examinations, Beauvoir found that working life was not as onerous as her parents had implied. Without the constant threat of obstacles and failure, life felt like she was permanently on vacation. She could now do and dress as she wanted to. Her mother had always dressed her in drab and durable cotton and wool. She now bought silks, crêpe sheen, velours. One of Beauvoir's literary characters from the 1930s, Chantal, was a philosophy teacher who took pleasure in dressing stylishly. She describes the wonder-struck gaze of the pupils, who probably do not think I am quite real. In the prime of life, Beauvoir wrote that by the time she met Sartre again in October, she had jettisoned all other attachments and thrown herself into the relationship with Sartre wholeheartedly. But once more, the diaries tell a different story. From September to November, Jacques and the llama both still featured in her deliberations, with tenderness and love expressed for both. Again, Beauvoir's contradictory accounts raise the question why? Why did she gloss over the other men in her life when she wrote her memoirs, assigning Sartre a more dominant place in narrative than he occupied in life? In 1929, Beauvoir was still weighing up his merits. On September the 27th, she wrote that Sartre did not understand love because despite being an experienced player of the game, he had never truly experienced love itself. Her doubts persisted. On October the 8th, she wrote that she must learn not to regret this love any more than when I am near him. She had seen Jacques again when she got back to Paris in September, which renewed her interest and briefly demoted the llama from her considerations. She thought her future required a choice between happiness with Jacques and unhappiness with the help of Sartre. It is not funny, she wrote, to love two men, and each one so passionately. According to Beauvoir's memoirs, in the autumn of 1929, Sartre told Beauvoir that she had a double personality. Given the various disjointed accounts she gives, and her obvious feelings of being torn between possible lives, it doesn't take a great stretch of the imagination to see how he might have felt this way. She even had a name for her possible lives. She called them mes possibles, my possibles. Normally, he said, she was the beaver. But sometimes the beaver disappeared, and the less enjoyable from his point of view, Mademoiselle de Beauvoir took her place. Mademoiselle de Beauvoir felt sadness and regret. The beaver did not. Episodes like this could be taken to support suspicions that Sartre gaslit Beauvoir, making her doubt herself in order not to challenge his dubious behavior. But Sartre did not invent this distinction. We have already seen Beauvoir's diaries use a similar one as early as 1927. When she enjoined herself, don't be Maubert and de Beauvoir. Be me. Don't have a goal imposed from outside, a social framework to fill. What works for me will work, and that is all. On Monday, October the 14th, Sartre and Beauvoir met in the Luxembourg Gardens and went for a walk. That afternoon's conversation would inspire thousands of people to try to emulate them, because it contained the defining discussion of their open relationship, the pact. They would have a 2-year lease, forsaking no others. And they would tell each other everything. To distinguish his relationship with Beauvoir from his relationships with lesser lovers, Sartre said to her, "What we have is an essential love, but it is a good idea for us also to experience contingent love affairs." They called their relationship a morganatic marriage, a marriage of people of unequal social rank, like Louis XIV and Madame de Maintenon. They did not clarify for posterity which of them was considered royalty, and which the commoner. In the second volume of her memoirs, Beauvoir wrote that at first she found their commitment to telling each other everything embarrassing. But then she came to see it as liberating. In Sartre, she thought she had found an observer who saw her with much greater impartiality than she could ever have about herself. He would be her life's witness. They would be open books to each other, comfortable in the knowledge that their reader meant no harm. She trusted him so completely that he provided the absolute unfailing security that she had once had from her parents or God. Given her early insistence on the importance of the view from within in her diaries, and the benefits of hindsight, it is difficult to know what to make of her confidence in Sartre's view from without. Was her trust warranted? Truly mutual? The Sartre and Beauvoir described in the prime of life were careful with the truths they told each other, since truths can be sharp weapons. Beauvoir made no claim, in later life, to having a timeless formula of successful communication. She thought that nothing she could say would grant couples perfect understandings of each other. She was often asked how they made their relationship work, and her response was that people need to work together to decide the nature of their own agreements. In her youth, she made the mistake of thinking that what worked for her was right for everyone, but it irritated her, by 1960, to be praised or criticized for the way they conducted their relationship. It's not hard to see why, given how little they really knew about it. As events unfolded in 1929, Beauvoir did reach giddy heights of love for Sartre. But she had also wavered since meeting him in July, and in the week after they made their pact she continued to have doubts. On October the 15th they were together again, and Mademoiselle de Beauvoir threatened to appear. She felt dejected and regretted her choice, but managed to conceal her sadness from Sartre before he left, and she broke down in tears. On the 21st of October 1929, she decided, and underlined in her diary, "I cannot live this year without Sartre." It was just as well, for 2 days later Jacques embarrassedly informed her that he was engaged to someone else. The next day the Lama and Streetfo both came to console her. The Lama told her that men like Jacques were attractive at 18 but soon lost their luster, because they lived on their fortune instead of making it. Jacques had inherited his father's business. He accepted his place in the pre-established order of things in a way that Simone never would. Streetfo took her for a hot chocolate at Les Deux Maguettes. She was grateful for their comfort despite her growing attachments to other men. She still had tears to cry, whether for Jacques, the imagined future in which she fulfilled her family's expectations, or some combination of both. In the prime of life, Beauvoir wrote that she and Sartre, in the early days of their relationship, succumbed to spiritual pride. They thought they were radically free but in fact fell prey to several illusions. They didn't acknowledge any emotional obligations to others. They took themselves to be pure reason and will, failing to recognize how dependent they were on others and how sheltered they had been from the world's adversities. They didn't have much money, but they met luxury with disdain. What was the point of grasping for things that weren't within reach? Instead, they cultivated the riches of a shared imagination, stocking it with stories, ideas, images. When it wasn't literature, it was Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, or Descartes, regularly punctuated by excursions to galleries or the cinema. In November, Sartre went to Saint Cyr to serve in the Meteorological Corps. After the 2 years were up, Sartre envisaged spending some time apart from Beauvoir. He had applied for a job in Kyoto, Japan, which if he got it would begin in October 1931. But then, he told her, they would meet each other in distant locations around the world, perhaps Istanbul, to be together before parting ways again for new adventures alone. Beauvoir did not share exactly the same dreams of solitary expeditions, but she did not feel able to tell Sartre what she wanted. Even so, Sartre was still only part of her life. In the same November, the third entry of her diary, she wrote about how she wanted Sartre's mouth against her mouth, followed by a paragraph about a letter from Jacques, happiness to have seen Streetfo, and another paragraph in which she describes wanting the Lama's hands in her hair, his body to brush her body. It is unclear, at this stage, why Beauvoir took such pains to protect Sartre from her thoughts. But it is clear that she saw no contradiction in loving several people at the same time, whatever their respective faults. Sartre's military service involved training at Saint Cyr, which was close enough to Paris that 3 or 4 days per week, Beauvoir could travel to meet Sartre for dinner, sometimes with their mutual friends Pierre Gil and Raymond Aron. On Sundays, Sartre came to Paris to see her. After the training was finished, Sartre was sent to Saint Symphorine meteorological station, not far from Tours. They wrote to each other most days, and Sartre had a week off each month plus Sundays. So between his trips to Paris and Beauvoir's weekly visits to Tours, they saw each other regularly, even if it wasn't as often as she would have liked. He called her, "my dear little wife." She called him, "my little husband." But the euphoric highs of the previous summer quickly dissipated. The next month, on the 25th of November 1929, was when Jaja died. Beauvoir recorded only the date in her diary. A teardrop blurred the ink. Beauvoir's diaries go silent after Jaja's death, only resuming the next month, after Sartre upset her. When she joined the study group at the Cité Universitaire, she thought she had met people who accepted her as she was a philosopher who wanted to seek the truth and live it. But now Sartre seemed to have grating expectations. Was he too telling her what to be and not to be? What she did and didn't understand? Among other things, she wrote, "I understand the contingent life better than he wants to say." The disagreement broke out the day before Jaja's funeral because Sartre had told her that she was too encrusted in her own happiness. So again tears flowed, tears not bitter, tears where already a force is born, tears from which I feel that the Valkyrie will rise, awaken from this long sleep of happiness. At this stage in their relationship, a pattern was starting to form as the years went on. Beauvoir would often turn to people other than Sartre when she needed emotional support. After Jaja died, Simone turned to Helene. But even so, at the funeral on December the 13th, she was overcome by the mournful vision before her. These were the same faces in the same spaces where she had imagined Jaja's wedding. Sartre clearly thought she had the capacity to write great things. But it is just as clear that at important moments he lacked compassion for her suffering. And over the first year of their pact, Beauvoir had many doubts about Sartre, herself, and the impact of the pact on others. In December of 1929, when Matthieu Herlama was visiting Paris, he discovered a letter from Sartre on her desk. She had not been open with Matthieu about the changing nature of her relationship with Sartre. Now the Lama said he could never trust her again, and wrote her a letter insisting that she see him while he was in Paris. Beauvoir copied out Matthieu's words in a letter of her own to show them to Sartre. "I have had my fill of the pretty situation that now exists, as a result of that September of yours and the 2 months of lying which followed it, and I deserve something better than the crumbs that you both offer me with such elegance." So Matthieu did not want crumbs, but what did he expect? He was married himself, so it was hardly consistent to expect her to be faithful to him when he clearly didn't practice fidelity himself. To Sartre she expressed little sympathy, condemning Matthieu's jealousy as disagreeable. But she was beginning to understand that contingent life meant different things for Sartre, and for her she didn't want to hurt the people she loved. She wanted to be with them, and, frankly, this life didn't throw her into anything. Know that Jacques was married, Matthieu was far away, and Sartre was leaving. But it is unclear at this stage whether she was starting to doubt the value of the contingent life itself, or just this particular chapter of it. During Beauvoir's first year on her own, she continued to see her parents for lunch regularly, but told them little about her life. Although she missed Sartre when he was away, she enjoyed her curiosity-quenching pursuits of the previously forbidden. She went on dates with almost anonymous, visited a brothel. Her father didn't understand why she hadn't taken a teaching post, and dismissively told his friends that she was having her Paris honeymoon. But she knew that her first teaching post was likely to be in the provinces, and she did not want to leave the Paris she was only just discovering. She briefly entertained the idea of becoming a journalist, since that might allow her to stay in the capital, but the pull of teaching philosophy prevailed. In June 1930 she wrote in her diary that she had always had a desire to be strong, to work, to create her own works, and she could only agree with Sartre that she should give this first place in her life. But she had already begun to dread the end of their 2-year lease. comparing it to a looming death. She was certain she wanted to write, but she underwent doubts about her abilities to realize her dreams of writing, thinking, "I have no talent, I can't." She berated herself for her laziness and lack of willpower. On the one hand, on the other hand, she could not tell whether Sartre was helping as much as she anticipated. "He speaks to me like one speaks to a little girl. He only wants to see me happy, but if I am satisfied with myself, he isn't happy. I have lied to him every time I was sad." Initially, she found his friendship incomparable. When they talked philosophy, he seemed to be dedicated to the same thing she was, uncovering the truth. So why would he stop short of the truth when it concerned her feelings? And why was she, having rejected the role of dutiful daughter, accepting the part of a woman who pretends to be happy even when she is spoken to like a girl? She felt like she had lost her joy, her inspiration to write, even her ability to believe his words when they said "I love you." There is no record of exactly what Sartre said that she found so discouraging. But her father and her culture instilled in her the message that women were not creative. History was a testament to their lack of originality. Jean-Paul de Beauvoir wrote that although the sisters clearly enjoyed literature and art in their childhood, neither she nor Simone had a eureka moment in which it was decided that they would be a painter or a writer. It took Jean-Paul years to exercise these words as she developed her painting. Simone, too, would later reflect on her youth as a time when she felt despair at her own lack of originality despite her strong sense of vocation. Letting her imagination speak, creating something herself, seemed impossible. Georges de Beauvoir's damning view of women's capabilities was shared, to some degree, by many of the philosophers Simone read. In her student diaries, she quotes several lines from Arthur Schopenhauer, who, in an essay on woman, wrote that women are the second sex, inferior in every respect to the first, which exists solely for the continuation of the human species. He thought that it was possible for women to have talent, but never genius. When Simone was considering a career in journalism, one of her wealthy cousins, the same one who had helped her father in the past, had arranged a meeting for her with Madame Poirier, one of the joint editors of L'Europe Nouvelle. She told Beauvoir that to succeed in journalism she needed to have ideas to contribute, and asked her, "Do you have any ideas?" "No," I said, "I didn't." Meanwhile, Monsieur Poirier, the husband of this editor, suggested another kind of career progression, making unwanted sexual advances, and telling Beauvoir that he would introduce her to powerful people if she was willing to get ahead that way. Beauvoir declined the advances and his offer. But when the couple invited her to a cocktail party, she decided going along was worth a shot. When she arrived, she felt very out of place. Her wool dress was conspicuously modest in a room full of satin. In the autumn of 1930, Simone began to think that her love of Sartre had taken too much of herself, that she had lived through him and neglected her own life. "I lost my pride," she wrote, "and that is how I lost everything." Looking back on her giddily high reunion with him the previous October, she felt strongly that Sartre loved her less than she loved him. It seemed now that she was just one of Baladin's adventures. She had given him her soul in an awestruck moment, losing herself without realizing it. She still loved him, but she described her love as more habitual, weaker, less purely tender. He had lost the luster of perfection now. She saw his desire to please, his amour propre, the reddening of his face when he spoke loudly, and how easily he could be influenced. Her love had lessened, but there was also a physical problem. Her body's tyrannical desire had been awakened and demanded satisfaction. This problem was made worse because Sartre did not suffer from it. He preferred seduction to sex. The circumstances in which Beauvoir agreed to the pact, namely, seeing both Mathieu and Jacques as part of a present and future in which her heart and body would find love, may explain the readiness with which she accepted it. In their absence, she was forced to admit the power of her physical appetites, but despite their promise to tell each other everything, she did not, at first, raise this with Sartre. Beauvoir's upbringing did not encourage her to express her desires or consider her emotions to be significant. But it is also possible that her censorious approach to emotion at this point in her life may have been exacerbated by Sartre's behavior and the philosophy that underpinned it. Sartre, in his 1943 philosophical work Being and Nothingness, described sexual desire as trouble because it clouded and compromised freedom. He was similarly intolerant of emotion, which he thought a free person could and therefore should choose not to feel. Once an ex-lover, Simone de Beauvoir, told the 21-year-old Sartre that she felt sad. The letter he sent by reply made no effort to conceal his disgust. Do you expect me to soften before this interesting pose you decided to adopt? First for your own benefit, and then for mine? There was a time when I was inclined toward that kind of play acting. Nowadays I hate and scorn those who, like you, indulge their brief hours of sadness. Sadness goes hand in hand with laziness. You revel in it to the point of writing to me 500 kilometers away, who will very likely not be in the same mood I'm sad. You might as well tell it to the League of Nations. Beauvoir saw tears glisten in Sartre's eyes in the cinema once, but that was art, and there was no place for crying in life. So Beauvoir's mixed emotions and unwelcome sexual desire were committed to the pages of her journals, which didn't offer such rebukes. In later life Beauvoir recalled having admired Sartre's detachment sometimes. He claimed that great writers had to cultivate dispassion if they wanted to capture emotion rather than be taken captive by it. But at other times she felt like words had to murder reality before they can hold it. And she didn't want reality to die, she wanted to relish in it, to taste the richness of its flavors for herself rather than embalming it for posterity. Although they agreed that literature was important, they disagreed about what it was. And what it was for Sartre. New words were powerful. But he thought all literature consisted of deception and disguise. Beauvoir thought it could do more and read Virginia Woolf withThe. Here was a woman who wanted to close the gap between literature and life. Beauvoir wanted to know the world, and to disclose it, truly. In her second volume of autobiography, Beauvoir wrote that philosophically she frequently found Sartre to be careless and inaccurate, but she thought his bravado made his ideas more fruitful than her own precise and scrupulous thoughts. In this and in many other instances Beauvoir portrayed herself as responding with reverence rather than recognition that Sartre had had advantages, which developed confidence, that she lacked. In the Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter, Beauvoir described Sartre as the perfect companion, the man she had been dreaming of since she was 15. I wanted husband and wife to have everything in common. Each was to fulfill for the other the role of exact observer which I had formerly attributed to God. That ruled out the possibility of loving anyone different. I should not marry unless I met someone more accomplished than myself, yet my equal, my double. But his observations weren't quite as exact as she later made them out to be. He refused to see her emotions as meaningful and dismissed her sexual desires. 20 years later, in The Second Sex, Beauvoir wrote about the woman in love, a woman who makes her man so central to her life that she loses sight of herself. The woman in love abandons even her own judgment, trying to see everything through the eyes of her beloved, to follow his preferences in books, art and music. She loses interest in the world if he is not there to see it with her. She is only interested in his ideas, his friends, his opinions. She thinks her value is conditional, that she has value because she is loved by a man. When she hears him say "we," Beauvoir wrote, it is her supreme happiness, because she has been recognized by the beloved man as part of him. When he says "we," she is associated and identified with him. She shares his prestige and reigns with him over the rest of the world. Writers such as Hazel Rowley have taken such passages to be autobiographical descriptions of the young Beauvoir. After all, in her autobiography Beauvoir described her young self as an ancillary bingendan, intellectual parasite. As we have seen, some pages of the diaries can be taken to suggest that instead of asking herself what she wanted or expressing what she wanted to him, she asked how she could be what he wanted. But although Beauvoir elided Sartre's flaws in her memoirs, she chronicled them in her diaries. Before she met Sartre, she was already reading the books he was reading: Gide, Claudel, Guy, Alain, Pascal, Leibniz, Lagno, Nietzsche, and a separate diet of English books that Sartre lacked the skill to read himself. She did use the word "we," but not only with Sartre. And even if Beauvoir did portray herself as the woman in love with Sartre in her memoirs, it is unclear whether she was that woman in real life. She may have depicted herself in this ancillary way not out of factual fidelity or narrative necessity, but feminist commitment because she thought that telling the story in a certain way would give it greater power. Despite the confidence of her 18-year-old self that she had something to say, that her intelligence was keen and penetrating, the young Beauvoir does not always seem to have realized that her intellect, too, was fecund enough to attract parasites. As the memoirs recount them, Beauvoir and Sartre's conversations about ideas continued on the railway platforms of Tours and Paris. Sartre would greet her excitedly and tell her about his latest theory. Then she would point out the flaws in his argument. She helped him refine the ideas for which he became famous. He, in turn, told her she was not original. When you think in terms of problems, you aren't thinking at all. This criticism can be read as a dismissal, but it can also be read as harsh, but fertile encouragement. In the prime of life, Beauvoir wrote that Sartre began to be irritated by her dependence on him, not because she was dependent, but because he thought she was less full of ideas than she had been when they met. That she was in danger of being the kind of woman who relinquished her independence and contented herself with being a man's helpmate. When Sartre told her this, she was furious with herself. But the reason she gave for her fury was that she had disappointed him. There are different vantage points from which to view this dissonant blend of dependence and independence in Beauvoir. At some points she was unsure that Sartre was best for her, or brought out the best in her. But it seems clear that despite her early sense of vocation as a writer, she lacked confidence and would resist praise for decades, downplaying the positive aspects of reviews of her work and focusing on the negative. To an extent, the image of their relationship that has been passed down to posterity reflects Sartre's self-confidence and her self-doubt, but that is not all it reflects. By October 1930, her doubts about Sartre were strong enough that she imagined finishing it. At times she wanted to leave Sartre. She ached for Jaja and her previous self. Although she had attained what she thought she wanted, she felt unfulfilled. Caresses, work, pleasures, is this all there is? In the final entry of her diaries, we see Beauvoir grieve for lost futures, lost selves she should have become in the company of other friends. I have sinned, I have sinned, I have sinned. Oh, I do not want my life to be like this. Oh, this is not what I dreamed of. Tomorrow I will see the dear little man Sartre and all will be finished. But today, I don't know where these regrets are coming from. Oh, Jacques, my purity, my dream, my love? But you weren't these things. Jaja, I cannot stand that you are dead. But I am alone without you and I don't even know what I want. I want to go. I want to leave Sartre and go with you for a walk, just with you, to speak, and to love you, and to walk, far from here, far. At this point we become much more reliant on her memoirs and letters for the details of her life, and so temporarily lose access to the view from within. Despite Beauvoir's doubts and fluctuations, she still chose Sartre. But she did not choose to restrict herself to his caresses, his pleasures, his work. Several writers and reviewers have speculated that Beauvoir would have been happier if she had married Sartre. But this claim overlooks two things. First, that she had already reached the conclusion that marriage was immoral before she met Sartre. And, second, Sartre's primary role in her life was clearly defined from the beginning. He was the incomparable friend of her thought. It was in that respect that he was necessary to her. Sexually and emotionally, he was far from it. During her first year in Paris after the augurgiation, she had lost touch with many of her previous friends. Jaja was dead. Jacques was married, others had moved away. She no longer saw Merleau-Ponty, or that holy Willies. The only people she introduced to Sartre were H.L. Ni, Gigi, Streetfo and Fernando. But soon the Jerises, too, left Paris for Madrid. Even so, Sartre's friends provided ample diversion. Beauvoir later described this period of her life as a delectable but chaotic stew of people and events. She described herself as lazy at first, decompressing after the intensity of the previous year's studies. But eventually the scholar in her reasserted itself, and she got back to reading and writing. She joined the Anglo-American Library, over and above the books I read with Sartre. Her memoirs say, Beauvoir read Whitman, Blake, Yeats, Cinch, Sean O'Casey, all of Virginia, Woolf, Henry James, George Moore, Swinburne, Frank Swinnerton, Rebecca West, Sinclair Lewis, Theodore Dreiser, Sherwood Anderson. She attributed to Sartre an interest in the psychology of mysticism, in fact an interest of her own in the diaries of the 1920s. So they read Catherine Emmerich and Saint Angela of Foligno alongside Marx and Engels. In most aspects of life, she liked overdoing things. Even when she went on vacation, it generally meant that she traveled and worked somewhere else. In these early days, their pact met with disapproval from their families. Sartre's stepfather, Joseph Mancy, flat out refused to meet Beauvoir since they were not married or engaged. But Sartre offered no protest. He continued to make weekly visits to his parentships without her. His mother would sneak out to meet them on her own sometimes, but only rarely and always briefly. Further problems arose when Sartre, true to his word, did not conceal his admiration for his first serious contingent lover, Simone de Beauvoir. In fact, he used Beauvoir as an example to goad Beauvoir out of her inactivity. Beauvoir felt upset and jealous, but she also thought Beauvoir was a fraud. She was a high-end prostitute who recited Nietzsche to the lawyers and town clerks she laid flat. Beauvoir had never slept with a man she didn't love and did not understand Beauvoir's ability to use her body so casually. Sartre, in turn, found Beauvoir's feelings contemptible. He thought she should control her passions since letting them rule her compromised her freedom. From his point of view, emotions were lame excuses. All she needed to do was use her freedom to choose otherwise. Beauvoir attempted to purge her jealousy, but at points during their life together it was a real struggle. In addition to facing jealousy in herself, she was also sensitive to, and suffered from, the pain others felt as a result of their jealousy over her. Beauvoir had started her relationship with Sartre with multiple men in her heart, and she continued to find things to appreciate about other men. But they did not always appreciate her divided attention. Once, she was about to take a 10-day road trip with Pierre Gil, a mutual friend of Sartre's and Beauvoir's, when Mathieu arrived in Paris. He was staying for 2 weeks, without his wife, and expected to spend time with Simone. They had made up after his discovery of Sartre's letter the previous December, but now she told him that she was about to leave Paris for 10 days with someone else. Mathieu told her that he would never see her again if she went. She objected that it was hardly fair to let Gil down. She thought it was an offense against friendship to back out of a joint project unless it was unavoidable to do so. They had reached an impasse. Mathieu was unconvinced and did not retract his ultimatum, so they went to the cinema together, still at odds. Beauvoir wept all the way through the film. Nevertheless, she enjoyed her February vacation with Gil. Being in a car was still a novelty for her. She had enjoyed drives in Paris with the Nizans. But this would be many days of travel, seeing places that she'd only read about in books. They visited Avallon, Lyon, Uzerche, Beaulieu, Rocamadour, and her favorite province. They spent leisurely days soaking in the heat of the Proven Alsun. She loved seeing the Camargue, Aigues-Mortes, Les Baux and Avignon. Alongside the beauty of new places, this trip brought inequality before her eyes in ways she had never seen before. Contrary to Simone Weil's Barbe, Simone de Beauvoir had often been hungry. But she did not realize the extent of her privilege. Even so, on their way south she visited a cousin who showed them around a factory. The workshops were dark and filled with metallic dust. During the preceding year, Beauvoir had read Marx, and was beginning to see an important connection between labor and values. But what is read on paper in Paris can be rather removed from what is felt on the factory floor. She asked how long the laborers worked, and her eyes stared at the answer: 8-hour shifts of hot monotony. When they got back to Paris, Sartre had had a letter informing him that he had not got the job he wanted in Kyoto, and Beauvoir had a letter from Mathieu saying things were over between them. Sartre was now waiting for his future to be decided by the French Ministry of Education. That spring he was offered a post in Le Havre, not far from Paris. He accepted. Beauvoir, too, was offered a post in Marseille, 800 kilometers away. As this distance loomed large before her, she became very anxious, realizing that although she sometimes longed for solitude, she was also afraid of it. The previous year had taught her things about herself that made this exile fill her with dread. Sartre, seeing her turmoil, suggested marriage as husband and wife. The state would be obliged to post them near each other. There was no point suffering on principle. He said they were opposed to marriage, but what good did it do to be martyrs about it? Despite his protest that marriage was merely a legality, Beauvoir was surprised by his suggestion. She saw reasons against it from both of their points of view. Marriage doubles one's domestic responsibilities and social chores. She wanted neither. And she also did not want to be a source of resentment, and feared being Sartre's wife would make her precisely that. Sartre was already experiencing a crisis with respect to disappointed expectations. He had dreamed of a bold posting in Japan, fitting glory for a Baladin, and instead was going to be teaching in the provinces. Joining the order of married men was not what he needed. The memoirs put Beauvoir's reasons first, although she didn't spell out her philosophical objections. But nevertheless they have often been overlooked, with the result that it has been assumed that she accepted this arrangement for Sartre's sake. In the memoirs, Beauvoir said that the only thing that might have changed her mind about joining this bourgeois institution was children. And while in her teens she expected to be a mother, she no longer foresaw this as a possible future. She had come to see childbearing as a purposeless and unjustifiable increase of the world's population. Whether for rhetorical or genuine reasons, Beauvoir frames her decision not to have children in terms of her vocation, a Carmelite nun, having undertaken to pray for all mankind, also renounces the engendering of individual human beings. She knew she needed time and freedom in order to write. So, as she saw it, by remaining childless I was fulfilling my proper function. So, instead of marrying, Beauvoir and Sartre revised the terms of their pact. Their relationship had become closer and more demanding than it had been when they first made it. Now they decided that although brief separations were permissible, long solitary sabbaticals were not. Their new promise was not lifelong. They decided they would reconsider the question of separation when they entered their 30s. So, although Marseille would separate them, Beauvoir left Paris on a firmer footing with a clearer future with Sartre. During the summer of 1931, Beauvoir crossed the French border for the first time in her life. She was 23 years old and had always wanted to travel. Jaja used to come back from Italy overflowing with mesmerizing descriptions of different people, different places. Beauvoir and Sartre were planning to visit Brittany that summer when Fernando, Gerasi Street Fast's husband, invited them to Madrid. Sartre still had a little money left over from a legacy he'd inherited from his grandmother. He paid their fares and turned his final francs into pesetas. They visited Figures on their first evening, and kept finding themselves repeating, "We're in Spain." They traveled from there to Barcelona and Madrid, Segovia, Vila, Toledo and Pamplona. At the end of September, they parted ways for Le Havre and Marseille. When Beauvoir later reflected on her arrival in Marseille, it stood out as a completely new turn in her career. She arrived alone, with nothing she couldn't carry on her own back, knowing no one at all. The previous year had left her feeling as though she didn't know herself all that well, and her time in Marseille provided her with the space and time to resurrect parts of herself that had atrophied. She found the people provincial and uninteresting. But she had always loved to be outdoors. Sartre did not. So on her days off work she left early in the morning to walk. She started off with walks of 5 or 6 hours a day and gradually worked her way up, covering vast distances in an old dress and espadrilles. She hitchhiked despite friends and colleagues' concern it was dangerous for a woman to walk alone, and she had some narrow escapes. But she enjoyed the solitude of walking and thought this pastime saved her from boredom, depression and regret. She became compulsive about finishing the routes she planned, sometimes to endangering extremes. Her new teaching post had eased some family relations. Fran Ois even persuaded Georges to take a week's holiday in Marseille. Fran Ois had begun to be impressed by Simone. She saw her as a professional woman with a good income. But she was disappointed that Sartre still figured in Simone's life. Spinsterhood would have been preferable to his incomprehensible presence. Beauvoir was relieved when her parents returned to Paris. She wanted to get back to walking. Elny also came to visit twice. The sisters had never been separated for so long before that year, and they missed each other. Simone took Elny walking with her, but one day, Elny became feverish. Simone was so determined not to be derailed from her plans that she left her shivering sister in hospice to wait for a bus while she continued on her way. This would not be the only time in her life that her resolution to stick to a plan seemed to overtake her compassion. At work she did not shy away from teaching what she thought, and she scandalized her pupils and their parents with her teachings on labor, capital and justice. Her mind had grown liberal in many respects, but sexually she still sided with convention. She was scandalized when another teacher made sexual advances, because the person wooing her was a Madame Tourmalin. Marseille offered fewer human distractions than Paris, so on her teaching days Simone began to write again. She did not publish anything from this period, but every plot she penned returned to the same thing, the mirage of the other and the relationship between honesty, freedom and love. She did not want this peculiar fascination to be confounded with a mere commonplace love affair, so she made her protagonists both women to save their relationship from sexual undertones. She visited Paris when she could. If her visit was brief, she only saw Sartre and her sister, but if she stayed longer she enjoyed seeing other friends. When she and Sartre were apart they wrote letters, and when they were together she read Sartre's work in progress, and he read hers. He was writing a dissertation on contingency. By June of 1932 Simone had heard that the following year's teaching post was in Rouen, only an hour from Le Havre, and an hour and a half from Paris. In the prime of life Beauvoir described herself emerging from this year triumphant. She had felt lonely living at such a distance from the significant others in her life, but she now knew that she could rely on herself. In the 1980s she told Bear that her time in Marseille was the unhappiest year of my life. She loved Sartre and wanted to be with him, and couldn't tell whether to attribute her heartsickness to missing him or regret. That summer brought more travels: southern Spain, the Balearics, Spanish Morocco. When Beauvoir moved to Rouen at the beginning of the school year, she took a room in the Hôtel La Rochefoucauld, near the train station. She found the train chiseling reassuring. Escape was within easy reach. She made a new friend in Rouen, Colette Audrey. Nijane knew Audrey from communist circles, and she was a colleague of Simone's at the Like. Simone introduced herself, and at first Colette found her brusque and bourgeois. Audrey was a committed Trotskyite, and Beauvoir thought she was intimidating. She was well-dressed, self-assured and always talking politics. Before long they were lunching regularly at the Brasserie Paul. Audrey admired Beauvoir's determination and enjoyed her laughter. She saw Simone's affections as ferocious. Beauvoir's forthrightness could be crushing when she wanted it to be. Her reputation for not suffering fools stayed with her throughout her life. When Sartre came to visit Rouen they went out as a trio. Beauvoir had explained the nature of her relationship with Sartre to Audrey, saying that it was based on truth rather than passion. Audrey described the intense and ebullient conversations they had as a new kind of relationship, the likes of which she had never seen. I can't describe what it was like to be present when those two were together. It was so intense that sometimes it made others who saw it sad not to have it. Rouen made the continuation of their pact much easier. Beauvoir and Sartre now spent their time between Rouen, Le Havre and Paris, where they took an increasing interest in theatre. Simone Jolivet's lover was a theatre director, Charles Dullin, and they took a keen interest in learning his art. Whatever the city, they populated their conversation with people. In the 1930s they developed the idea of bad faith, mauvaise foi, a concept of dishonesty that they thought did greater justice to human experience than Freud's concept of the unconscious. In the prime of life Beauvoir credits this concept to herself and Sartre. Beauvoir starts by saying that Sartre worked out the notion of dishonesty, bad faith. But she continues using we set out to expose bad faith. There was a particular teacher, a colleague of Beauvoir's, whose behavior led Beauvoir to a moment of clarity. I've got it, Beauvoir told Sartre. Jeanette Lumire is unreal, a sort of marriage. Thenceforth we applied this term to anyone who feigned convictions or feelings that they did not in fact possess. We had discovered, under another name, the idea of playing a part. The concept of bad faith would become one of the most famous in 20th century philosophy. The idea of playing a part was famously illustrated by Sartre's waiter in Being and Nothingness. So why does Beauvoir say that we discovered it? In the 1930s it is very difficult to determine the extent to which Beauvoir and Sartre were indebted to each other with any certainty. As H. L. Nee's husband, Lionel Roulet, described it, their relationship, then was, one of constant talking. Through their constant talking, the way they shared everything, they reflected each other so closely that one just could not separate them. At this stage Beauvoir and Sartre became increasingly aware of politics. Although the more mature Beauvoir would look back on herself and Sartre as spiritually prudent, politically blind. Through Audrey and others their paths crossed with Trotskyists and communists, but they did not see the proletarian struggle as their struggle. Their struggles were philosophical. They discussed problem of how to understand their rational and physical selves. They wanted to understand freedom. And Sartre saw the body, its physical appetites and habits as posing a threat to it. Although in 1929 Beauvoir did not challenge Sartre's intolerance of passion and emotion, in the early 1930s she began to object to his position. He still thought his body was a bundle of muscles. Detached from his emotions, it was weakness to succumb to tears or to be seasick. But Beauvoir disagreed. She thought eyes and stomachs were subject to their own laws. They wrote and researched, reading voluminously. One evening, near the turn of 1932-33, Sartre and Beauvoir were sitting with Raymond Aron at the Bec de Gaz, on the Boulevard du Montparnasse. Aron had been spending a year in Berlin, at the French Institute. He was studying the philosophy of Edmund Husserl, whose work and the philosophical method for which he is famous. Phenomenology was still relatively unknown in France. As Beauvoir tells the story in The Prime of Life, Aron pointed to his cocktail glass and told Sartre they could make philosophy of it. Sartre went pale with excitement when he heard this. It was precisely what he wanted to do, to return philosophy to the everyday, and root it in descriptions of experience. Sartre and Beauvoir would both employ phenomenological methods, although each with their own twists. In its founder Husserl's hands, phenomenology describes the things themselves phenomena by trying to pare back the distractions, habits and presuppositions of everyday life and received opinion. It is a philosophy that recognizes that there is a distance between things as they appear to us and things as they are, or as we think they should be. For Sartre, this was a revelation. But the phenomenological method was not entirely new to Beauvoir. When she was at the Sorbonne she studied with Jean Barrésy, who had encountered phenomenology and whose work paid attention to the lived experience of Christian mystics. And Bergson's concrete metaphysics, too, used a similar approach. We have already seen that before Beauvoir met Sartre she was thrilled when she read Bergson's praise of the novelist who could untangle the web of the conventional self. She wanted her work to express palpable reality. But neither Bergson nor Barrésy was as fashionable in 1930s Paris as Husserl. At the height of Bergson's fame people would crowd around the doors and windows of his lecture rooms, craning to hear what he said. But so many of them were women that men began to suspect that what Bergson was doing was not, in fact, philosophy. As one 1914 review put it, Bergson was nearly suffocated by scent when women attended his lectures. But had Bergson really been a philosopher, no woman would have listened to him. In April of 1933 Beauvoir and Sartre spent their Easter vacation in London. They were amused by the English conventions. They saw bowler hats and umbrellas, Hyde Park speakers, taxis, tea shops and peculiar fashions. Their differences frequently asserted themselves with greater force when they were traveling, perhaps because they did not have the separate living quarters and lives they had when at home, and in London this was as true as ever. Beauvoir, more fluent in English literature and culture, wanted to trace the steps of Shakespeare and Dickens, visit Kew Gardens and Hampton Court. Sartre wanted to linger in lower-class streets, guessing at the thoughts of their inhabitants. In letters to Beauvoir Sartre sometimes wrote lovingly that they were but own. But in London their two-ness kept reasserting itself. In Oxford Sartre liked the city's streets and parks, but he did not appreciate the snobbishness of the English undergraduate and refused to go into the colleges. Beauvoir chided him for his churlishness, and went into the colleges by herself. In London, too, their wishes diverged. How could he not want to go to the British Museum? Beauvoir continued to find much to admire in Sartre's thoughts, but she did not like all of them. They were sitting in Euston Station when he explained how London fitted into his overall outline of understanding the world. Beauvoir was irritated by his habit of generalizing, and thought his hypothesis was spurious. This was old terrain, they had argued it before, but Beauvoir insisted once again that words could not do justice to reality, and that reality should be faced, warts and all, with all its ambiguity and uncertainty. Sartre replied that observing and reacting to the world wasn't good enough, that they should try to pin it down in words. Beauvoir thought this was nonsense. London couldn't be understood after a 12-day visit. He wanted to write their experiences instead of living them, which grated against her own prime allegiance to life, to the here and now reality. In January 1933 they saw Hitler become chancellor. By May 2 the German embassy in Paris was flying a swastika. In here and now reality, Beauvoir and Sartre watched as Jewish scholars went into voluntary exile and books were burned in Berlin. In her autobiographies, Beauvoir would claim that she and Sartre had not yet been converted to political engagement, that their only concern during this period was themselves, their relation, their lives, and their books to comb. They had little interest in public and political events, instead preferring to retreat into their imaginations to keep the world at arm's length. She said, "At every level," Beauvoir wrote in the prime of life, "we failed to face the weight of reality, priding ourselves on what we called our radical freedom." But she was not totally withdrawn from the world. That Auguste Beauvoir was passionately interested in a story that was everywhere in Paris, about the crime and trial of a young working-class woman called Violette Noziere. Noziere had killed her father after he raped her, although the press rarely put it that way, prompting many women to wonder why did they call it incest. The debate her trial provoked was so intense that it was compared to the Dreyfus affair. In Rouen, Beauvoir continued to work on her philosophical and literary projects. She began a new novel in 1933 and had private German lessons 2 or 3 times per week with a refugee she met through Colette Audrey. She modeled her novel on Stendhal, and wanted to tell a story that paralleled her own, showing the stagnation of bourgeois society, and the need for individual revolt. Although she was not one of its protagonists, Jaja was written into this story under the name and a paragon of piety and loyalty. It was not the last time Beauvoir would rewrite Jaja's life. She was just beginning to discover the cathartic and clarifying effects of writing literature. But she thought the characters in her first novel lacked depth, that they were not true enough to life, so she gave up on it not long after. But she returned to the same themes and, indeed, characters in subsequent work. Although they didn't have much money during this period, Beauvoir and Sartre continued to travel whenever they could. In 1934 they visited Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Alsace, Corsica. They went to Hanover to see Leibniz's house. That year Beauvoir did not try to write anything, making a conscious decision to focus on reading and learning instead. She studied the French Revolution and read Husserl in German. Sartre was working hard on a philosophical treatise on Husserl, the transcendence of the ego, and still editing the manuscript on contingency, but without much success. During Sartre's year in Berlin, Beauvoir took 2 weeks off to visit him. Sartre had met a contingent woman there, whose company he enjoyed a great deal, Marie Girard. Beauvoir met and liked her. In her memoirs she wrote that although this was the first time that Sartre had taken a serious interest in another woman, she was as comfortable with their arrangement in fact as she was in principle, although she was capable of jealousy and did not underrate it. She continued to feel secure in Sartre's estimation. They were discovering Faulkner and Kafka together, exploring the question of how to write life well. At this stage they both thought that salvation could be achieved through art. Sartre's biographer, by contrast, calls this the first crisis in their relationship. Personally, Beauvoir felt that her most serious problem was still the one she wrote about in her student diaries: how much of herself to keep and how much to give away. She still didn't know how to reconcile her longing for independence with the feelings that drove her so impetuously towards another person. She made controversial claims in her classes, for example, that women were not exclusively intended for bringing children into the world, and lent her students books their parents found objectionable. Some parents raised formal complaints, accusing her of attacking the sanctity of the family. Fortunately, the school's inspector took her side. During this period, while Beauvoir and Sartre were both unknown teachers, Sartre underwent a period of depression. He was disappointed and bored. and later called this time of his life the gloomy years. Sartre felt like a failure. He had not expected to end up a provincial school teacher, finding life so monotonous and his genius so unacknowledged. Comparison didn't help much, either. Paul Nizan had already published 2 books, Aden, Arabi in 1931 and Antoine Bloy in 1933. The first was well received and the second, even more so. Even Mahieu, who had failed the agrégation, was well on his way to a reputable career. He would go on to be Director General of UNESCO. But Sartre had published nothing. He wasn't famous and was starting to get worried that whoever is not famous at 28 must renounce glory forever. He knew it was absurd to think this, but he felt no less agonized by his lack of achievement. One day in November they were sitting in a seaside cafe in Le Havre. Both of them felt listless, worried that life had sedimented into relentless repetition and that nothing new would ever happen to them. Beauvoir was so upset that evening there were floods of tears, and her old hankering for the absolute, that is, God, made a new appearance. In these moods she felt like human endeavors were vain and reproached Sartre for making an idol out of life. The next day, she was still upset by her revelation and got into an argument with him. Sartre thought there was no truth to be found in wine and tears, and explained her mood by the depressing effects of alcohol rather than metaphysics. She thought that alcohol lifted a veil, revealing the ugly face of truth. Both of them had to confront the disappointing dissonance between their expectations of adult life and its reality. Sartre was starting to lose his hair, and he didn't know what to do with his manuscript on contingency it was still too dry. Beauvoir had an idea: why not make it a novel? It needed fictional depth and suspense. Sartre loved detective stories, so could he write his philosophical question as a fictional quest? In his third draft, he would set the novel in Le Havre and base the main character, Antoine Roquentin, on himself. Her criticism was detailed and exacting, but that was why he took her advice invariably. In the meantime he set it aside to work on his philosophical essay on the imagination. It had been commissioned by Henry Delacroix for an academic publisher, Alcan, and researching the subject had made Sartre wonder about dreams and hallucination. A friend from the École Normale, Daniel Lagach, had specialized in psychiatry and told Sartre that he would arrange for him to try mescaline if he wanted to have hallucinations for himself. So in February of 1935 Sartre went into St. Anne's Hospital in Paris for a supervised mescaline injection. He was observed for several hours, and unfortunately did not experience the kind of trip he had hoped for. Instead of happy hallucinations, he was chased by the deformed shapes of the objects in his room, seeing crabs and other crustaceans, which haunted him for weeks to come. When he saw Beauvoir that evening he was not at all his usual self. Eventually he admitted that he was fighting depression, and worried he was a little prone to catastrophize, that he was on the edge of chronic hallucinatory psychosis. Beauvoir wryly reminded him that according to his own philosophy the mind controlled the body, that his only madness was believing that he was mad. In March 1935, Hitler enacted a conscription law reintroducing mandatory military service, increasing the army from 100,000 to 555,000 soldiers. France began to panic, left and right. They signed a pact with the USSR in which Stalin approved the French national defense policy. With Russia on one side and France on the other, peace seemed secure. Germany had no chance of winning a war, so surely they wouldn't be foolish enough to wage one. In retrospect, Beauvoir would write that her way of reading the paper remained decidedly frivolous. At this stage she took avoidance to be the best approach to the problems Hitler posed. Only one of Beauvoir's letters from 1935 was published in Letters to Sartre, dated July the 28th. She makes no mention of politics, safe to say that the only newspaper she can get in the Ardche is Le Petit Marseillais. That Easter they visited the Italian lakes, and Sartre seemed in good spirits. But when they returned he couldn't find it in himself to pretend that he was normal. He was listless and felt low enough that a doctor advised him to avoid being alone. So Beauvoir made every effort to be with him when she could, and to arrange others to be with him when she couldn't. Writing in 1960, Beauvoir said that she couldn't really understand Sartre's crisis. She began to realize that although their situations looked very similar, They were not as alike as they seemed at first sight. To pass the augurgiation and have a profession was something he took for granted. But when I stood at the top of that flight of steps in Marseille in 1931, when she began teaching, I had turned dizzy with sheer delight. It seemed to me that, far from enduring my destiny, I had deliberately chosen it. The career in which Sartre saw his freedom foundering still meant liberation to me. Beauvoir continued to take deep satisfaction in reading philosophy, which she described as being a living reality for her, and she continued to write. She worked on a collection of short stories, When Things of the Spirit Come First. One of them told the story of how Jaja was driven to madness and death by the Puritan moral code of her environment. Another is now thought to have inspired Sartre's short story, The Childhood of a Leader. In the period between 1926 and 1934, Beauvoir made 7 attempts at writing novels. But she would have to wait over 40 years to see any of this material published. And in the meantime, Sartre would at last meet with philosophical and literary success, and their relationship would become, or at any rate, appear to become, a trio.